On that sultry evening in July of 1845, when the heat lay thick as a blanket over the rice fields of Rosemont Plantation, and the air hummed with mosquitoes rising from the swamps, 4 men stood in the parlor of the big house, knowing that their nightmare was about to begin again. The nightly ritual that Mistress Arabella Sinclair had instituted 3 months earlier. A twisted game where they would be forced to compete for her attention like trained animals performing tricks, knowing that the winner would face degradation, but the losers would face punishment. Trapped in a choice between horror and agony, with no third option, no escape. No mercy in a world that had declared them less than human and given one woman absolute power over their bodies and souls. And if this story grips your heart, leave your like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Because what you're about to hear reveals how systematic dehumanization can transform ordinary people into monsters and reduce strong men to broken shadows of themselves. Rosemont Plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of South Carolina lowcountry, 18 miles from Charleston through swampland and forest. Isolated enough that the screams from the slave quarters could not be heard by neighboring plantations, built by Arabella's grandfather in 1790. It had grown wealthy on rice cultivation using a labor force of 400 enslaved people who worked in conditions so brutal that disease killed 1 in 5 every year. Replacing them required constant purchases at the Charleston slave markets, a business expense that the Sinclair family accepted as the cost of maintaining their fortune. Arabella was 31 years old in 1845, married for 12 years to Lawrence Sinclair, a man who spent most of his time in Charleston gambling and drinking, rumored to have contracted syphilis from the brothels on State Street. He visited Rosemont perhaps once a month and showed no interest in his wife beyond her ability to maintain the plantation's productivity in his absence. They had no children, whether by choice or biology no one knew, and Arabella had grown bitter and twisted in her isolation, power without love, wealth without purpose, beauty fading with no one to appreciate it except the slaves who feared her. The 4 men she selected for her ritual were chosen not randomly but with calculated cruelty, designed to maximize their suffering and her sense of control. First was Josiah, 42 years old, the head driver who supervised field workers. He had a position of relative privilege that Arabella could destroy with a word, making him desperate to please her. Second was Gabriel, 35 years old, a house servant who had been raised in the big house and spoke with refined diction that Arabella found amusing. She enjoyed humiliating educated slaves, enjoyed proving that their intelligence meant nothing against her power. Third was Elijah, 26 years old, newly purchased from a plantation in Georgia. He had been separated from his wife and infant daughter in the sale, and Arabella used his grief as leverage, promising that if he pleased her, she might arrange to purchase his family. A lie she never intended to fulfill, but that kept him compliant and desperate. Fourth was Solomon, only 19 years old, born on Rosemont. His mother Miriam worked in the kitchen. Solomon was beautiful in the way that made white women uncomfortable, with features that suggested mixed ancestry somewhere in his lineage. Arabella chose him specifically to corrupt that beauty, to prove that even innocence could be broken. The ritual began each night at 10 o'clock, after the other house servants had been dismissed. The 4 men would gather in the parlor where Arabella waited, dressed in evening gowns that cost more than a slave's life, jewels at her throat and wrists, the trappings of civilization masking the barbarism of what she was about to orchestrate. She would make them stand in a line and she would walk down it slowly, inspecting them like livestock at market, commenting on their appearance, their posture, their expressions, searching for any sign of fear or disgust that she could punish. Tonight, she would announce, her voice bright and cheerful as if organizing a parlor game, "We shall play question and answer. I will ask each of you questions about literature, history, philosophy, and the one who answers most correctly will have the privilege of attending me in my chambers, while the others will receive 10 lashes each for their ignorance." Or another night, "Tonight we shall have poetry, each of you will recite verses, and I shall judge who speaks with the most passion." The most feeling, the winner receives my favor. The losers sleep in the root cellar without food until tomorrow evening. Or most cruelly, tonight I want you to tell me why you deserve my attention more than the others. Convince me of your worth, make your case, and may the best man win. Those who heard this story could not remain indifferent, just as you shouldn't. If this story touched you, leave your like so it won't be forgotten. Because what these games revealed about human psychology under conditions of absolute power is both fascinating and horrifying. The competitions forced the men to participate in their own degradation, to actively compete for the privilege of being abused, which Arabella understood would break their spirits more effectively than simple force ever could, and beyond that, it turned them against each other, destroyed the solidarity that had been their only source of strength, made them see each other as rivals rather than fellow victims. Josiah, as the oldest, tried at first to maintain some dignity, to lose the competitions deliberately so that he would face lashing rather than the deeper violation of winning. But Arabella caught on quickly and changed the rules, announcing that losers would be punished. Not only themselves, but their families would face consequences. Josiah's wife Rachel worked in the big house as a laundress. Suddenly, Rachel began receiving extra duties, being denied food, being threatened with sale, and Josiah understood that he had to win the competitions to protect her. Gabriel, the educated house servant, found his learning turned into a weapon against him. Arabella would ask impossible questions, set up scenarios where no answer was correct. Enjoy watching him squirm as he tried to navigate conversational traps designed to humiliate him regardless of his response. She would have him read aloud from books, and then mock his pronunciation. Or worse, have him read romantic poetry, and then force him to explain what the words meant to him personally, turning literature into a tool of psychological torture. Elijah, the newcomer still grieving his lost family, became the most desperate competitor. He believed Arabella's lies about reuniting him with his wife and daughter. He would win the competitions through sheer intensity of performance, degrading himself completely in hopes of earning the reward that would never come. The other three men pitied him, but also resented him for making them look less committed by comparison, exactly the division that Arabella wanted to create. Solomon, the youngest, developed a different strategy. He made himself into what Arabella wanted, learned to read her moods and respond accordingly, became a performer so skilled that he could fake genuine emotion. This survival mechanism worked in the short term, but destroyed something essential in his character. By age 23, he would be unable to feel authentic emotion at all. Every interaction calculated and false, his soul hollowed out by years of constant performance. The ritual continued every night for 8 months. 240 nights of competitions and degradation, and the effects rippled out across the entire plantation. The 4 men became isolated from the other slaves, who didn't know whether to pity or resent them. They received better food and lighter work assignments during the day, which looked like privilege, but was actually part of Arabella's strategy to turn the slave community against them, to ensure they had no support network, no source of strength outside her control. The other slaves whispered about them, speculated about what happened in those nightly sessions. Some said the 4 men were Arabella's lovers and were complicit in their own situation. Others understood the truth but were too afraid to speak it aloud. A few tried to help in small ways. Josiah's wife Rachel would leave extra cornbread hidden in their quarters. Gabriel's mother Dinah would pray over them, but these gestures of solidarity were rare and dangerous. Anyone who showed too much sympathy might be drawn into Arabella's web themselves. The breaking point came in March of 1846, when Solomon, after one particularly brutal competition that required the men to fight each other physically for Arabella's amusement, decided he would rather die than continue. That night, after the ritual ended, he walked out of the big house, past the slave quarters, and into the swamp. He kept walking until the water was over his head, and then he let it take him. His body was found 3 days later, tangled in cypress roots, and when they pulled him out, his face was peaceful, the first peace he had known in almost a year. Solomon's death created a crisis, not of conscience for Arabella but of logistics. She needed 4 men for her competitions. 3 wasn't enough for the dynamic she enjoyed, so she immediately selected a replacement, choosing Marcus, a field hand of 27 who had never worked in the big house before. She gave him 1 day to learn the rules, and then threw him into the arena with Josiah, Gabriel, and Elijah, men who now looked at every newcomer with a mixture of pity and relief. Pity for what he was about to endure, relief that someone else might now absorb some of Arabella's attention. But Marcus was different from the others. He had been born free in Baltimore, lived as a free man until age 19 when he was kidnapped by slave catchers while working on the docks, his papers destroyed, his identity erased, sold south into slavery. Unlike the others who had been enslaved their entire lives and had learned survival through submission, Marcus still remembered freedom, still carried rage instead of resignation, and when Arabella tried to break him with her games, he refused to play. The first night, when she asked him to compete, he simply stood silent. When she threatened him with punishment, he said, "Do what you will, I will not dance for you." When she ordered him whipped, he took the lashing without making a sound. And when she tried to use his isolation and suffering to force compliance, he remained stone-faced and defiant. Marcus's resistance terrified the other 3 men, because they knew it would bring consequences for all of them. And they were right. Arabella, frustrated by her inability to break Marcus, intensified the competitions for Josiah, Gabriel, and Elijah, made them more degrading, more frequent, more cruel, punishing them for Marcus's defiance. But something unexpected happened. Marcus's strength inspired something in the others that they thought had died. A memory of dignity, a flicker of resistance. It was Gabriel who acted first, the educated house servant who had been humiliated through literature. One night during a competition, he simply stopped mid-sentence in his poetry recitation and said, "No, I will not continue." Arabella was so shocked that for a moment she couldn't respond, and in that moment of silence, Josiah joined in, saying, "Neither will I." And then Elijah, the desperate man who had been chasing the lie of family reunion, said, "Nor I. You can kill us all, but we won't play your games anymore." The united resistance broke something in Arabella, perhaps because it reminded her that despite all her power she was ultimately alone, that the slaves she had tormented still had something she could never possess: the ability to choose death over degradation, to value dignity more than survival. She started screaming, ordering them whipped, ordering them locked in the root cellar, ordering punishments that grew increasingly hysterical and contradictory. But before those orders could be carried out, something happened that no one expected. Arabella's husband Lawrence returned to Rosemont unannounced. He had been away for 2 months and came back earlier than planned because he had heard disturbing rumors in Charleston about his wife's behavior. And he walked into the big house at the exact moment when Arabella was screaming at the 4 men, her mask of civilization completely shattered, her madness on full display. What Lawrence did next was not motivated by morality or compassion, but by concern for family reputation and property value. He immediately sent Arabella to Charleston to stay with her sister, announced that she was suffering from female hysteria and needed rest, and then he sold all 4 men to different plantations before they could tell anyone what had happened. Josiah went to a cotton plantation in Alabama, Gabriel to tobacco fields in North Carolina, Elijah to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, and Marcus was sold to a rice plantation in Texas, as far from South Carolina as Lawrence could arrange, scattered to the 4 winds so their stories could never be corroborated. Arabella never returned to Rosemont. She lived with her sister in Charleston for 3 years and then died suddenly in 1849. The official cause was listed as brain fever, but the doctor who attended her told others privately that she had died from an overdose of laudanum. Whether accidental or intentional, he could not say. She was 35 years old, beautiful even in death, buried in a fancy tomb in St. Philip's churchyard, where Charleston society mourned the loss of one of their own, never knowing or caring about the men whose lives she had destroyed. The story of the nightly rituals at Rosemont survived only in fragments, passed down through the slave communities of South Carolina. Most of the details were lost because the four men were separated, and because speaking of such things was dangerous, but the basic outline remained. A cautionary tale about what happens when human beings are given absolute power over others. A reminder that slavery corrupted not just through physical brutality, but through psychological torture that left scars no one could see. Of the four men, only Marcus lived long enough to tell his story to someone who wrote it down in 1863, at age 44. He escaped from the Texas plantation during the confusion of the Civil War and made his way to Union lines. He joined the United States colored troops and fought in several battles, surviving the war and living until 1891. In his final years, he told his story to a researcher working for the Freedmen's Bureau, describing the nightly competitions, the systematic degradation, the way Arabella had turned them against each other and made them complicit in their own abuse. The worst part wasn't the beatings, Marcus said in that interview. Wasn't even what she did to our bodies. The worst part was what she did to our minds, making us compete, making us perform, making us destroyers of ourselves and each other. She wanted to prove that she could take away not just our freedom, but our humanity, our dignity, our very souls. And the terrible truth is, she almost succeeded. If we hadn't found the strength to resist at the end, I think she would have completely destroyed us. And if this story made your heart beat faster, go now to the channel and subscribe to discover the other voices that time tried to silence, because these are not just historical curiosities or shocking anecdotes. They are testimonies to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the darkest circumstances. They are reminders of what humans are capable of doing to each other when systems of oppression are allowed to flourish. And they are warnings that we must remain vigilant against any form of dehumanization, any system that declares some people less worthy than others, any concentration of power without accountability. Because the lessons written in blood and tears across American history remain as urgent today as they were in that long-ago time when slavery was the law of the land, and some people believed they had the right to own not just bodies but souls.